Imagine, like a mob boss calling up your business to, politely warn your employees to evacuate
Right.
just right before he burns the entire building to the ground.
It's crazy.
Sounds absurd, right? Like something out of a movie.
Yeah.
But in March 2026, that is exactly what Iran did to the global energy supply.
Yeah.
And it's just wild how quickly the ground beneath our feet can shift.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because if you look at the world today, March 21, 2026, it looks profoundly different than it did just, 30 days ago?
Basically a month, yeah.
As we sit here right now, global oil prices have spiked to a staggering $126 a barrel. And the Strait of Hormuz, which is literally the world's most crucial energy artery, has been effectively closed to normal transit since early March.
It is a profound shock to the global system. I mean, we are looking at a scenario that geopolitical strategists have theorized about for decades, but, they never actually expected to see it materialize at this sheer operational scale.
And that is exactly our mission for today's deep dive. We are unpacking exactly how we got here. Specifically, how Saudi Arabia went from being this regional peacemaker boasting a policy of pragmatic neutrality
Right.
to standing on the absolute brink of preemptive war in just 3 short years. And more importantly, we want to figure out what this means for you, for your wallet, your local inflation rates, and global macroeconomic stability in general.
So to do that, we're looking at a highly sensitive, brand new policy analysis paper prepared for G7 strategic deliberation.
It's a big one.
It really is. It's authored by Dr. Fareed Novin, and it's titled Saudi Arabia at a Systemic Inflection Point. It's basically a granular, mathematically backed look at the geopolitical earthquake happening right now.
Now, before we jump into the mechanics of this, I just want to make an important note for you listening, because we want you to get smart on this rapidly evolving crisis without drowning in dense academic jargon. We're going to break this down conversationally.
Keep it accessible.
Exactly. However, this source material deals with highly sensitive, ongoing political and military events involving the U.S., Israel, and Iran. So we want to be incredibly clear up front. We are strictly and impartially reporting on the strategic analysis presented in this G7 document.
We aren't taking any sides here.
Right. We're not taking sides. We're not endorsing any political or military viewpoints. Our job is literally just to help you understand the core mechanics of the crisis as outlined by the intelligence in front of us.
And that's the baseline we operate from, right? We're looking purely at the mechanics of statecraft, deterrence, and, consequence.
Okay, so let's rewind the clock just a little bit to set the stage. Because between 2021 and 2024, Saudi Arabia was playing a very specific, almost subdued role in the region, right? They were calling it pragmatic neutrality.
They were, yeah. If you think back to March 2023, Saudi Arabia actually signed a Chinese-brokered rapprochement with Iran.
Which was huge at the time.
Massive. They restored diplomatic relations after a 7-year freeze. Riyadh was essentially positioning itself as a convening power. The underlying logic was purely economic. It was like, let's reduce our exposure to regional conflicts, mediate between rival blocs, and just focus entirely on our own massive domestic economic growth.
They didn't want the drama.
Exactly. They wanted to balance relations with Washington and Beijing without being overly dependent on the security umbrella of either superpower.
Which makes sense on paper, obviously. But then February 2026 happens, February 28th specifically. The United States and Israel launch Operation Epic Fury.
Right.
And then a few weeks later, on March 18th, Israel strikes Iran's Asaliya gas complex. And the dominoes just start violently falling.
The acceleration was just breathtaking because Iran's response to those strikes wasn't just rhetorical bluster. They executed a highly coordinated, symmetric retaliatory campaign across the entire Gulf.
It wasn't just talk?
Not at all. They hit Qatar's Ras Laffan liquefied natural gas facility with ballistic missiles.
Which, just to underline the scale of that for everyone, Ras Laffan accounts for roughly 20% of global LNG supply.
Yeah, it's immense.
A sudden 20% drop doesn't just mean higher prices,
Yeah.
It means energy grids in parts of the world suddenly face the very real threat of rolling blackouts.
It's a massive choke point. And the campaign didn't stop there. Drone strikes caused massive fires at Kuwait's refineries. The UAE had to completely halt operations at their Habshan gas facility.
Wow.
And Saudi Arabia itself saw its capital, Riyadh, targeted by ballistic missiles, along with drone strikes on its eastern gas facilities, and the Samaref refinery in Yanbu, which, sits strategically on the Red Sea.
It makes me think of an analogy. Saudi Arabia's pragmatic neutrality was basically like trying to quietly sip a drink in the corner of a massive bar fight.
Yeah, pretty much.
Like you're minding your own business, you're trying not to make eye contact with anyone, but eventually someone is going to throw a chair at your head anyway. Neutrality just couldn't guarantee immunity anymore once the fists started flying.
That perfectly illustrates the collapse of their strategy. Iran had explicitly warned that if its domestic facilities were attacked, Gulf energy infrastructure would be treated as legitimate, symmetric military targets.
They literally told them it was coming.
They did. They made good on that threat to demonstrate that no one gets to sit out of a regional conflict.
But this brings us back to that bizarre detail I mentioned right at the top of the show. The G7 paper notes that before the missiles and drones hit, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, which is Iran's elite military branch, actually issued explicit evacuation warnings for these named facilities across the Gulf states.
Yeah, they called ahead.
Why would they do that? I mean, it feels entirely counterintuitive to warfare,
Right.
like the mob boss analogy.
What's fascinating here is the sheer calculation behind that move. It wasn't an act of mercy, right? It was a highly calibrated dial turning.
How so?
Well, by issuing those warnings, the IRGC maximized the economic disruption. They sent global energy markets into a complete panic and deeply rattled foreign investors, which hits the Gulf states where it hurts the most.
Right, the money.
Exactly. But by intentionally minimizing civilian casualties, they avoided the kind of massive, visceral public relations disaster that would inevitably force the international community, specifically the United States, into a heavier, direct military response.
Oh, wow. So they wanted the economic shock without crossing the threshold into total unconstrained war.
You hit the nail on the head. They weaponized the threat to capital rather than the threat to human life.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. If pragmatic neutrality is dead, and the Gulf energy infrastructure is actively on fire, how does Saudi Arabia react?
Right.
Because according to the G7 paper, their reaction wasn't just to, buy more Patriot missiles from the U.S. They activated something completely unprecedented that they signed back in September 2025, the Strategic Mutual Defense Agreement, or SMDA, with Pakistan.
Yeah, and context is everything for understanding the SMDA.
Yeah.
This pact was signed just 8 days after a totally different Israeli airstrike in Doha deeply unsettled the Gulf states.
Back in 2025.
Right. That 2025 strike basically shattered Riyadh's confidence in traditional U.S. security guarantees. They realized they needed a different kind of insurance policy, one that wasn't reliant on Washington's political mood.
And it is a very specific, terrifying kind of insurance. The paper quotes Pakistan's defense minister saying that Pakistan's nuclear capabilities will be made available to Riyadh.
Yeah, that's the quote.
But I have to push back on this a little bit because it sounds impossible. Saudi Arabia is a signatory to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT.
True.
And Pakistan has, an estimated 170 nuclear warheads, but they famously aren't part of the NPT.
Mm.
So is this actually a real functional nuclear umbrella, or is this just a giant geopolitical bluff meant to scare Tehran?
To understand how this works, we have to look at the legal loophole. Because Pakistan never signed the NPT, they technically aren't bound by the international laws prohibiting the transfer of nuclear technology.
Wait, really? So it's legal?
Well, in a terrifyingly technical sense, offering this umbrella sits in a gray area of international law. But beyond the legality, in the realm of deterrence theory, ambiguity is the entire point.
How so?
Yeah.
Like the bluff is the point.
Kind of. A threat that cannot be definitively ruled out performs almost the exact same psychological function as a threat that is explicitly guaranteed. If Iran even suspects there is a 5% chance Pakistan might launch a weapon on Riyadh's behalf, it alters their calculus.
That makes sense.
The paper introduces this concept of multiplex deterrence. During the Cold War, you had two superpowers, clear lines, and red phones connecting them. Now, in the Gulf, you have overlapping, completely opaque umbrellas.
But wait, offering a nuclear umbrella is one thing. Actually launching a nuke on behalf of another country is literal suicide.
Right.
Does the G7 paper actually believe Pakistan would risk its own destruction, like its own cities turning to glass, just to protect Riyadh's oil fields?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the paper points out that Pakistan's motivations aren't purely altruistic. Remember, Pakistan isn't just an outside observer throwing around geopolitical weight. They rely heavily on Gulf oil imports to keep their lights on.
Oh, right. So they're hurting too.
Exactly. With the Strait of Hormuz closed in March 2026, Pakistan's own economy is suffocating. They have a direct existential material interest in this conflict now. But your point about the crowded room is exactly what terrifies the G7 authors.
Because nobody knows where the actual lines are drawn anymore.
It is the definition of systemic instability. You have U.S. extended deterrence, which the Gulf doubts. You have Israel's unacknowledged but widely understood nuclear arsenal. You have Iran's threshold nuclear capabilities.
Right.
And now you have Pakistan offering this extra NPT extended deterrence to Saudi Arabia. When you have 4 different actors with varying degrees of nuclear capability and no clear communication channels or institutionalized red lines between them,
The risk of a catastrophic miscalculation skyrockets.
exactly.
So what does this all mean? Let's bring this down from the stratosphere of nuclear theory and look at what this all means for you, the listener. Because if you are sitting in traffic right now, you aren't thinking about multiplex deterrence.
No, you're definitely
You're
not.
thinking about the price of gas, the cost of groceries, and inflation. And this brings us to the economic tightrope Saudi Arabia is walking. Crude oil is sitting at $126 a barrel. Saudi Arabia's fiscal break-even point, the exact price they need to balance their national budget, is somewhere around $90 to $98 a barrel.
Right.
On paper, shouldn't Riyadh be absolutely thrilled? I mean, they are technically making money hand over fist, right?
It's an intuitive thought, but it is a total illusion, and the paper dismantles it perfectly. Yes, in the immediate short term, daily revenues spike, but war-driven price shocks are structurally toxic to an oil-producing nation.
Why? If the price is high, the profit is high. What's the downside?
Because when prices shoot up aggressively due to conflict, it destroys long-term demand. Entire industries shut down, countries accelerate their transition to alternative energy, and the global economy shrinks.
Oh, I see.
Furthermore, the volatility in the financial markets completely skyrockets the cost of sovereign borrowing. Saudi Arabia has massive capital expenditure needs, and suddenly, because they are viewed as a high-risk conflict zone, it is exponentially more expensive for them to borrow the money they need to build their future.
And the global ripple effects of that $126 a barrel are terrifying for the rest of us too, right?
They are grim. The Dallas Fed actually modeled this out. They found that a sustained closure of the Strait of Hormuz cuts global GDP growth by 2.9 percentage points per quarter.
That's massive.
Think about what a nearly 3% drop in global GDP means. That is immediate severe recession territory. Layoffs, frozen supply chains, massive inflation. On top of that, Oxford Economics warned that $140 a barrel is the absolute breaking point for the world economy. That is the threshold that would push Europe, the UK, and Japan into severe, sustained contraction.
But didn't the International Energy Agency step in? I saw they released like 400 million barrels from strategic reserves to calm the markets.
They did, but analysts warn that is effectively putting a Band-Aid on a bullet wound. That 400 million barrels only covers about 20 days of normal Strait of Hormuz flows.
Oh man, so it's practically nothing.
It temporarily masks the price, but it completely fails to solve the underlying structural shortage.
And all of this economic chaos directly threatens Saudi Arabia's massive domestic project, Vision 2030.
Right.
They've actually had incredible success recently. The paper notes that female labor force participation in Saudi Arabia hit 36.3% in early 2025, which is years ahead of their schedule.
Yeah, that's a huge milestone.
It creates what the paper calls a productivity cushion for their economy. But suddenly, they are trying to manage this massive societal transformation amidst a regional war. It's like trying to launch a luxury cruise line while someone is actively minding the harbor.
Great analogy.
You just can't focus on hospitality when the ship is taking on water.
That is the exact dilemma facing the Public Investment Fund, or PIF. This is the nearly $1 trillion sovereign wealth fund driving Saudi Arabia's future.
Right, the guy's building all the big projects.
Exactly. Suddenly, the PIF is having to hit pause on all their flashy, futuristic mega projects like NEOM. Instead of building linear cities in the desert, they are rapidly reallocating capital to buy Ukrainian interceptor missiles. They are being forced to prioritize sheer survival and logistical redundancy over architectural symbolism.
But amidst all this external chaos, there is one quiet success story internally, right? The Eastern Province.
Yes, and it's a critical mechanism to understand. The Eastern Province is where the vast majority of Saudi Arabia's critical oil infrastructure sits. It is also home to its Shia minority population.
Oh, okay.
Historically, Riyadh treated this population with heavy-handed, coercive security measures, constantly fearing they might align with Shia-majority Iran. But over the last decades, Saudi Arabia fundamentally shifted tactics. They started practicing true socioeconomic inclusion,
Like what? What did they do?
investing heavily in housing, education, and high-paying jobs in the region.
So they essentially neutralize the underlying grievances that lead to rebellion.
Precisely. By narrowing those economic disparities, they removed the underlying fuel that an external actor like Iran could use to spark a mass uprising.
That's smart.
So while the risk of small-scale precision sabotage remains like a lone actor attacking a pipeline, the existential threat of a massive internal revolt shutting down the oil fields from the inside has been largely mitigated through good, inclusive economic policy.
Okay, let's unpack this next part. Because if Vision 2030 is facing total collapse under this external economic pressure, how does Saudi leadership actually decide what to do next?
It's tough.
And this isn't just a gut feeling, right? The G7 paper reveals they are using cold, hard math to make this choice. They use a Bayesian game theory model to explain Saudi Arabia's decision-making process.
Yeah, and this is where the paper gets truly chilling, because it strips away the emotion, the rhetoric, and the politics and looks purely at the mathematical calculus of deterrence.
Okay.
The central question for Riyadh's leadership is simple. What is the exact probability that Iran is a rational actor just trying to bargain for a better position versus an existential aggressor intent on destroying the Saudi state?
So for those of us who haven't taken advanced statistics in a while, what exactly is Bayesian math?
Bayesian math is basically the science of changing your mind mathematically. You start with a baseline assumption, say an 80% belief that your neighbor is a peaceful person.
Right.
But then you mathematically adjust that percentage every time they do something aggressive based on the probability that a peaceful person would take that action. You continuously update your beliefs based on new incoming evidence.
So how did that mathematical belief revision play out for Riyadh?
Dr. Navin tracks it perfectly in the paper. Back in 2023, during the diplomatic détente, Saudi Arabia mathematically assessed an 80% probability that Iran was a rational status quo actor. They believed they could do business with them.
Makes sense.
But then we get the February and March 2026 sequence. Iran closes the Strait of Hormuz. The IRGC names specific Saudi refineries, issues those calculated evacuation warnings, and then physically strikes them.
The chair to the head in the bar fight. New evidence enters the equation.
Exactly. Iran sent a signal that was incredibly costly, one that a rational actor simply trying to avoid a wider war would never logically send. Because of that new evidence, Saudi Arabia's mathematical assessment flipped violently.
To what?
By late March 2026, Riyadh assesses a 90 to 92% probability that Iran is an existential aggressor.
Oh, wow. So what does that mean for their actual options on the ground?
Yeah.
Can you walk us through the payoff matrix, the paper outlines? Let's work this out.
It's a grim zero-sum calculus. In game theory, you assign numerical values to potential outcomes to figure out your best move. If Saudi Arabia chooses to just play defense, meaning they do nothing, absorb the drone hits, and hope international pressure stops Iran while Iran continues to escalate, the paper assigns that outcome a devastating score of -100.
Wait, so doing nothing gets a score of -100. What does -100 actually look like in reality? Is that just losing money, or is that something worse?
-100 represents the total catastrophic failure of the state's objectives. It means the complete collapse of Vision 2030, the permanent loss of foreign investment, hyperinflation domestically, and, potentially the collapse of the royal family's legitimacy in the eyes of their own citizens.
Oh, God. So it's basically the end of the country as they know it.
It is total attrition.
Okay, -100 is total failure. What is the mathematical alternative?
The alternative is taking the offensive. If Saudi Arabia decides to preemptively strike Iran, even knowing with absolute certainty that Iran will retaliate and cause damage, the mathematical score is -37.3.
Which is still bad.
It's obviously still a terrible outcome. It accounts for massive military costs, lost lives, and physical damage to their cities. But crucially, it avoids the total attrition of your infrastructure and preserves the state's underlying survival.
So just to translate this for everyone listening, this means that mathematically speaking, throwing the first punch has actually become the safer option for Saudi Arabia.
Exactly.
It is what the paper calls the risk-dominant strategy. Taking the offensive is literally mathematically less damaging than sitting back and getting picked apart.
That is the terrifying conclusion of the Bayesian model. When you put the numbers into the matrix, peace is no longer the logical choice. And it leads to the paper's ultimate calculation. Right now, as we sit here, the short-term probability of kinetic escalation, meaning a hot regional war, is currently estimated between 60 and 70%.
Either initiated by a direct Saudi preemptive strike or triggered inadvertently because Iran misperceives Saudi defensive mobilizations as an attack. Right?
Exactly.
A 60 to 70% chance of regional war. That is absolutely staggering.
Yeah.
With odds like that, what can the international community, specifically the G7, actually do to stop this from spiraling into a global depression?
Well, this raises an important question, right? What's the playbook?
Right. What can they do?
The paper outlines a three-part playbook, and it focuses on changing the underlying math. First, the G7 must clarify Pakistan's nuclear red lines.
Okay.
The G7 needs to have urgent, discrete dialogues with Islamabad to ensure this new nuclear umbrella has strict, unambiguous limits and functioning crisis communication channels, so nobody launches a weapon by mistake based on a radar glitch.
Very important. And the second part?
Second, the G7 needs to financially backstop Vision 2030.
So, like, give them an economic lifeline to lower the pressure.
Exactly. Use the International Monetary Fund to provide a massive liquidity guarantee. If Saudi Arabia feels their domestic economy is secure and they aren't facing that -100 scenario of total collapse, they are far less likely to panic and launch a preemptive strike out of sheer desperation.
That makes total sense. Change the math of the payoff matrix.
Right. And third, the G7 must help physically harden and aggressively expand the East-West Petroline to the Red Sea at Yanbu.
Right, because if you can pump the majority of the region's oil directly to the Red Sea, you bypass the Strait of Hormuz entirely.
Exactly. It essentially strips Iran of its biggest geopolitical chokehold.
It's about building structural resilience. If closing Hormuz no longer breaks the global economy, Iran's threats lose their coercive mathematical power.
That's the goal.
So to ground this all back for you, the listener, this is just a distant regional squabble over a patch of desert that you can ignore. This is a systemic crisis. It is a mathematical march toward a conflict that fundamentally threatens your gas prices, your inflation rates, and the entire global macroeconomic order.
It is a profound phase change in global security. We are witnessing the reemergence of direct interstate deterrence dynamics combined with economic warfare at a scale we haven't seen since the height of the Cold War.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We always try to leave you with something to chew on long after the audio stops playing. And there was one specific quote in the G7 paper from the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons that really stuck with me.
Yeah, that was its striking line.
They noted that the Saudi-Pakistan agreement effectively treats a nuclear umbrella like a tradable security service. So here is something to mull over. If deterrence is now essentially a subscription service, something that wealthy nations can just rent outside of the bounds of international treaties, what is stopping every other wealthy, vulnerable nation on Earth from simply going out and buying their own nuclear bodyguard?